The last fire of the season burned low under the cottonwoods. Beyond it, the green river moved slow and black between its frozen banks, whispering against the stones like something half asleep. A skin of ice had already begun to form along the shallows, and the men knew that before another moon their traps would be locked solid. The rendezvous at Pierre's hole was months behind them, and those who'd survived it, the fights, the fevers, the long pull south through snow and sage, were a different breed than when they'd come. Elias Boone Hardesty sat cross-legged by the coals, sharpening his knife against a whetstone no larger than a biscuit. The edge was already keen, but the motion soothed him. He was 35, lean as rawhide, with the hard plains of a man who'd lived too long outdoors. His beard was flecked with early frost, and his eyes, blue as glacier melt, had that distant look common among those who'd seen too much open country. Around him, the camp was silent save for the soft snore of mules and the crackle of the fire. They had fought the Comanche 3 days earlier, a sudden collision in a bend of the Sweetwater where the grass stood higher than a man's knee. It hadn't been a battle so much as a confusion of dust, gun smoke, and screams. When the smoke cleared, 3 trappers were dead, 1 was missing, and half their pack animals had scattered. Elias had taken a bullet through his coat sleeve and lost nothing but cloth and pride. They spent the next 2 days rounding up what stock they could find. The missing mule, a scrawny sorrel with a white blaze on her nose, turned up limping near a willow thicket. She was half mad with thirst and dragging her pack crooked. Elias went through her panniers by habit, counting powder, pelts, and trade goods. In the bottom of one saddlebag, wrapped in oiled buckskin, he found a packet that wasn't theirs. At first glance it was just a roll of parchment, the kind Spanish friars or government men used long ago. The outer layers were weather-stained, the edges curled, the seal broken. Inside, the ink had faded to the color of dried blood. Lines and symbols crossed each other in cramped detail. A river twisting westward, a string of peaks drawn like saw-teeth, and a small cross in red pigment beside the word Mina, mine, Elias muttered aloud. When he showed it to his partner, old Baptiste Duclos squinted and spat a mouthful of tobacco juice into the snow. "Bah! Ever fool out here got a Spanish map, mon ami. Half of 'em lead to Beaver, half to Bones." Elias rolled the parchment up carefully and tied it again. Still, someone thought it worth wrapping. "Oui," Baptiste said, grinning through his beard. "And maybe they wrap their dreams in buckskin now." They both laughed, but the laughter carried a wary note. Among mountain men, maps had a way of stirring trouble. More fights had been started over the promise of a lost diggins than over women or whiskey. Spanish gold, French silver, Aztec treasure, the old tales, moved up and down the rivers like smoke, never solid enough to touch. That night, as the wind came down from the Wind River Range, Elias spread the map beside the fire. The parchment was brittle but readable in the flickering light. He traced the river lines with his finger, following them east until they forked like veins. One bend reminded him of the Green, another could have been the Sweetwater or the Popo Agui. Above the red cross, faint block letters spelled something that looked like Cobre Viejo, Baptiste. Rolled in his blanket. "Go to sleep, Boone. You chase that thing too long, you'll end up like the rest of 'em. Ask poor Laframboise. Found his Spanish treasure, and the snow found him." Elias smiled without looking up. "You ever wonder where the first man saw gold, Baptiste? Someone must have found it once, otherwise the story wouldn't have teeth." The Frenchman grunted. "A fishhook got teeth too. Doesn't mean you bite." By morning the fire was out, and the camp smelled of frost and wet leather. They broke camp early, heading downriver toward the lower valley, where elk still ranged. The map stayed in Elias's coat, folded against his chest. He told himself it was nothing, just a curiosity, a relic of some long-dead prospector, but it itched at him all the same. They crossed a stand of aspen turned gold and bare, forded the river where the ice was thin, and followed a faint game trail up a ridge. From there the green spread out below them, a ribbon of pewter cutting through the sage. To the west rose the dark shapes of the Uintas. To the north, the mountains of the Wind River stood snow-white against the sky. Somewhere beyond them lay the country of the Crows, the Yellowstone, the edge of everything known. Baptiste pointed with his rifle. "See there? Smoke? Maybe Bridger's men." They rode down into a small camp of trappers, 6 men, rough as the rest, their hair bound in otter-skin cords and their coats patched with beaver. Among them was an old acquaintance, Hugh Glass himself, his left leg still stiff from the bear that had near killed him years before. The talk around the fire turned to the season's take, the news from Street, Lewis, and the rumor that William Ashley was selling out of the fur trade for good. "Too many men chasing too few beaver," Glass said, staring into the flames. "And the Blackfeet don't take kindly to company." Elias mentioned the parchment, half in jest. "Found it in a mule's saddlebag after the Comanche dust-up. Looks Spanish, marked with a cross." The men laughed, except for Glass. He leaned forward slowly. "You say Spanish?" "That's how it looks." Glass nodded toward the fire. "I seen one like that once, down near Taos. Old priest carried it rolled up in a cane. Said it marked mines worked before the crown pulled out. He was half mad, but he had the look of a man who'd seen something. When he died, nobody found the place." Baptiste chuckled. "Maybe this one yours, then." "Maybe," Glass said quietly, "or maybe it's another ghost's joke. Either way, keep it close. The sort of men that believe in those maps don't much care whose blood they spill for 'em." That night, Elias lay awake under his buffalo robe, listening to the coyotes yip along the ridge. The words echoed in his head, "Keep it close." He thought of Jedediah Smith, killed by Comanche only a year before, his journals lost and later found stained with sand and blood. Men like Smith had mapped half a continent with nothing but instinct and courage. And yet, here lay a different kind of map, one that might have come from another century, another empire. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of snow. Elias took the parchment from his coat and looked at it once more by starlight. The ink shimmered faintly where grease from his fingers had darkened it. He felt a strange mix of awe and suspicion, as if he were holding something meant to be forgotten. He folded it carefully, slid it back into the buckskin, and whispered to the night, "If there's truth in you, I'll find it. If not, may the mountains keep your secret." Far off, thunder rolled over the peaks, not summer thunder, but the deep mutter of avalanches breaking loose in the high country. The season was closing. By morning, the first snow of winter would fall on the Green River Valley, and the trail to the unknown would begin. Snow had swallowed the world whole. By mid-December, the Wind River country lay locked under a white silence so deep that even the river seemed to have forgotten how to move. The trappers built their wintering camp in a stand of spruce beside a frozen creek, the roofs of their cabins low and steep, their chimneys coughing slow smoke into the still air. Each morning the men thawed their traps with boiling water, then cursed when the jaws froze shut again before they reached the stream. Inside the main cabin, Elias Boone Hardesty sat near the fire, spreading the Spanish parchment on the pine table they used for skinning hides. The map looked older in that flickering light, as if the ink itself was dying. He had copied it twice now onto fresh paper from Baptiste's ledger book, tracing each contour with the patience of a monk. Every mark, every symbol, had become familiar to him. The twisted river, the triangle of peaks, the tiny red cross labeled Mina. Behind him, Baptiste stirred a pot of stewed beaver tail. "You'll wear holes through that thing with your eyes, mon frère." Elias didn't look up. Smith once wrote that no man truly knows a country until he's lost in it. "Maybe this map's just trying to show me where I'm lost," the Frenchman snorted. "Jedediah Smith is dead, and I don't fancy joining him." Elias smiled faintly. "Dead men still draw good lines. He mapped this country better than any army engineer." He tapped the parchment. "Look here, see this bend? Could be the Green. If so, this fork might run toward the Sweetwater, or maybe the Popo Aggie. And these peaks, Baptiste, they line near perfect, with the shape of the Wind River Range." Baptiste peered over his shoulder, squinting. "Or with 100 other mountains, all white and cold and waiting to kill us." The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. The cabin was built from green logs, and the sap hissed in the heat. "Over the noise," Elias said quietly. "You remember when Jedediah went west through the desert? Everyone said he was mad too, but he found the Great Salt Lake, the Humboldt, the trail to California. Maybe madness is the price of seeing farther than other men, Baptiste chuckled. Then you already paid. When the storm broke 2 days later, they dug out the horses and followed the valley north. The snow lay waist-deep in places, crusted hard enough to bear their weight. Steam rose from the animals' backs like breath from a forge. Elias rode ahead, compass in hand, measuring the lay of the land against the map's faint lines. At noon they came to a rise where the wind had scoured the snow away. From that crest the view opened wide. To the west stretched the white teeth of the Wind River Mountains. To the east the plains rolled away under a pale sun. Elias pulled the parchment from his coat and compared. The river bend below them curved just as the drawing showed a great bow of ice reflecting the sky. His pulse quickened. "Baptiste," he said, pointing. "You see that ridge beyond the timberline? Look at the slope's south face, broken by 2 gullies, just like the mark here." The Frenchman shaded his eyes. "Could be, or could be we see what we want." Elias said nothing. He tucked the map away as a wind gusted up the valley, carrying a hiss of loose snow like sand. For a moment the light dimmed, and he thought of all the men who had come this way. Before Bridger, Sublette, Fitzpatrick, Smith names whispered now like prayers. Most were gone, bones buried in mountain soil. Yet their trails endured, carved into the memory of the land itself. That night they camped under a ledge of rock where the wind couldn't find them. The stars came out, bright and cold. Elias sat wrapped in his buffalo robe, sketching the horizon by firelight. His journal was half filled already, weather notes, trap counts, scraps of crow words, and now the copied map with new annotations. He wrote slowly, in the same deliberate hand Jedediah Smith once used in his own journal. The map found in the mule's pack continues to conform, in measure, with the valleys of the Green and Wind rivers. I am persuaded it was drawn by a Spaniard or Mexican long before the present century. Perhaps it marks an old mission venture, or the trace of miners seeking the fabled Cobra Viejo. The ground is rich with iron and rumor alike. When he had finished, he closed the book and leaned back, listening to the pop of the fire. The snow reflected the flames in faint orange, and the smoke rose straight into the night. Somewhere far off a wolf called long, lonely, and low. Baptiste shifted under his robe. "What do you aim to do when the thaw comes, Boone? Chase this ghost till it kills you?" Elias smiled without mirth. "No, I just aim to see if it breathes." Weeks passed. The snow deepened, then began to melt around the edges of March. Trappers from other parties drifted through, bringing talk of spring rendezvous on the Popo Aggie, of Ashley's sale to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, of the price of plues falling back east. The fur trade was changing, and every man knew it. Beavers were thinning, markets shrinking, and the world beyond the mountains was already turning toward iron rails and law. Elias listened, nodded, but said little. His eyes were always to the west, to that line of mountains where the Spanish map pointed, to the idea of something buried there that was older than any trade or treaty. Not gold, not wealth, but proof that the stories carried by the wind might sometimes be true. On the first day the river broke open, he saddled his horse and slung the packs. Baptiste cursed in French and followed. "Mon ami," he said, shaking his head, "you walk with ghosts." Elias looked back at him, the faintest smile breaking his wind-burned face. "Then may they show the way." They rode out along the half-frozen river, the parchment safe in Elias's coat. Behind them, the smoke from their cabin thinned and vanished into the cold sky, the last sign of winter in the Valley of the Wind. By March, the thaw had begun half-hearted and mean, as if the mountains were reluctant to let go of their hold. The drifts shrank only by inches, crusted by day, and frozen harder each night. When Elias Boone Hardesty and Baptiste Duclos crossed from the Wind River drainage into the headwaters of the Yellowstone, they found the world neither winter nor spring, but something cruelly in between. Every hoofstep broke through slush to ice, every breath stung the lungs. Their traps hung useless, beaver had gone deep, elk wandered thin and shy, and what little meat they found spoiled before it could be eaten. The cold no longer preserved, it only tormented. Baptiste muttered curses in French. Elias kept silent. The Spanish map, rolled tight in its oiled wrapping, rode in the inner pocket of his buffalo coat, safe and unreadable. There were nights he doubted the thing's worth, yet he couldn't bring himself to throw it into the fire. It was on such a night, in a wind-blown gulch where the snow lay like ashes, that he stumbled on the trick that would later make him a legend. They had killed a bull elk that morning, big and hollow-eyed from wintering too long on bark. The meat, though lean, was all they had. Baptiste wanted to cut it up and hang it in the trees, as usual. Elias stopped him. "Won't last," he said. "Not in this weather. Sun by day, freeze by night. It'll rot faster than it dries." "Then what, Boone? Eat it all and starve tomorrow?" Elias crouched by the carcass, feeling the cold air coming down the ravine. He remembered a story from James Beckworth's camp, how the Crow stored meat for years in the high country, sealed in rawhide and frozen so tight the air itself could not touch it. And he remembered something else, from a Mandan winter he'd once endured on the Missouri. How they'd built smoke pits underground to dry corn without fire showing to the wind. "Smoke," Elias murmured. "Cold smoke." Baptiste blinked. "What kind of fool talk is that?" But Elias was already working. He cut blocks of frozen earth with his tomahawk, shaping them into a shallow pit. From his pouch he took a twist of willow bark, a handful of punkwood, and a strip of buffalo tallow. The fire he built was small and smothered, more a thought of fire than the thing itself. He fed it damp moss until it breathed pale threads of smoke, not heat, just ghostly vapor. Then he laid green spruce boughs across the pit, built a rack of willow twigs above, and laid the elk strips flat as shingles. Over that he spread a hide cover to trap the smoke. The air beneath turned hazy and sharp, with resin and fat. The smell made Baptiste wrinkle his nose. "Saints preserve us," he said. "You mean to feed the wolves with that stink?" "Let it be," Elias answered. "It's not the smoke that dries it. It's what the cold does to the smoke." All that night the pit smoldered, never flaming, only breathing. By morning the meat had darkened to the color of mahogany. When he touched it, it was firm, not frozen, but sealed, as though some invisible skin had formed over it. They packed it into rawhide bags and buried them in a drift near the creek, marking the place with 3 stones. Weeks later, when the thaw came in earnest, they dug one bag out again. Inside, the meat was still good dry, scented faintly of spruce, and clean as the day it was cut. Baptiste chewed a piece and blinked in surprise. "By the Virgin," he said, "it ain't turned." Elias smiled. "Frozen smoke, I told you." He wrote of it that night in his journal, found that by smothered fire and constant frost, the flesh keeps whole. Smoke turns the outer fat to a kind of hide. The air cannot spoil it. I believe it would hold through 2 or 3 winters, if buried deep. That was the beginning of the trick that would later be whispered through trading posts and camps from the Platte to the Yellowstone Boone Hardesty's frozen smoke meat, the secret that made starving winters survivable. They pushed westward then, following the edge of the high country. The snowfields melted into black mud, and the creeks swelled with thunder. Elias carried his map in its leather tube now, comparing its lines to the shape of the valleys they crossed. Each day he found some echo of the drawing, a bend of river, a notch in the mountains, but never enough to be sure. One evening they met a small band of crow hunters camped along the upper Yellowstone. The trappers traded tobacco for dried berries and pemmican, then sat by the fire exchanging stories. Through an interpreter, Elias asked the oldest man, gray-haired, wrapped in a painted robe, if he had ever heard of the old Spanish mines. The elder nodded slowly. "Long ago," he said in halting English, "white men came from the south. They dig in the red hills, take shiny stone. But the mountain spirits grow angry. They throw fire from the sky. The men run away. Some never find the trail home." He pointed toward the south, toward the Wind River Range where Elias's map had begun. "Mountain that looks like Buffalo Head," he said. "That is where they worked." Elias and Baptiste exchanged a glance. The same mark, a buffalo-shaped peak, appeared faintly drawn on the map's edge. Later, as the crow slept, Elias sat by the dying fire and unrolled the parchment once more. The stars mirrored the ink lines, constellations of peaks and rivers. The wind moved through the pines with the sound of distant surf. He thought of Smith again, how the man had crossed deserts with no more than a sketch and a prayer. He thought of the map's maker, whoever he had been, and wondered if that man, too, had sat by a small, uncertain fire, dreaming of gold that might outlast the flesh that sought it. Baptiste stirred and mumbled something in his sleep. Elias smiled faintly. The world around him was vast, cold, and utterly silent except for the thin curl of smoke rising from the embers, twisting toward the stars like a living thing. He whispered to it, half in jest, half in awe, "You keep my meat good for 3 winters, and I'll follow your trail wherever it leads." The smoke drifted upward, fading into the dark. Somewhere beyond those mountains, the old Spanish secret waited buried under time, waiting for a man stubborn enough to believe. Spring arrived late and mean, as if the country itself distrusted warmth. The rivers swelled with ice water, the plains steamed under sudden rain, and the sky changed moods by the hour. For Elias Boone Hardesty and Baptiste Duclos, it was a season of passage out of the high snows and into the rolling country of the Crow. Their horses were gaunt, the traps light, and the meat stores low. Yet the 2 men rode with a kind of quiet purpose. The Spanish map had become less a curiosity than a compass of faith. Each landmark seemed to hint at the next a river bend matching a curl of ink, a cliff shaped like the tooth of some ancient beast, a ridgeline that mirrored the jagged strokes of the parchment. The Crow called this place Apsaluk Ishka, the land between rivers. It was a country both open and secretive, endless, grass broken by sudden bluffs, hidden canyons where cottonwoods grew thick, and streams that disappeared underground only to rise again in mist. To a man with a map older than memory, it was a riddle written in stone. They found the first Crow camp on the edge of the Bighorn foothills, a ring of tippas standing pale against the greening earth. Smoke rose straight into the blue, and the smell of drying meat mingled with the scent of sage. Elias raised an open hand as they approached, his rifle slung low, his face unguarded. The headman, a tall Crow with silver streaking his hair, met them halfway. Through signs and scattered words of French and Crow, Baptiste made the greeting. They were offered food, a bowl of boiled marrow and parched corn, and a place by the central fire. When night came, the lodge filled with talk and smoke. Elias drew the parchment slowly from its case and laid it flat on a buffalo hide. The flicker of firelight danced across its surface. The old man leaned close, his eyes narrowing. For a long time he said nothing. Finally, he touched one brown finger to the red cross marked Mina. "This place," he said softly in his own tongue, "old diggings, made by men who came before our fathers. They carried thundersticks and shiny tools. Some say they took the fire of the mountains." He drew in the dust beside him the outline of a mountain, its crown wide, its face sloping forward like the head of a buffalo. They called it Pahaska Makoshe, land of the white buffalo head. Elias felt a pulse in his chest. The same outline, crude and faint, was inked in the lower margin of his map. "What happened to them?" he asked. The elder's eyes reflected the fire. "The ground swallowed them. The spirits were angry. Our stories say they still sleep there, their hearts turned to stone." Baptiste made the sign of the cross. "That's comfort for dead men, not for us." But Elias only nodded, his gaze fixed on the drawing. He knew the superstition. Well, every nation on the frontier had its own warning about greed and buried treasure. Yet beneath the Crow's words he heard something else. Not fear, but memory. They stayed in the camp for several days. Elias traded flints and awls for dried berries and sinew thread, and in return, the Crow hunters guided them east toward the country of the Bighorn River. Each morning before the sun crested the hills, Elias studied the map anew, adjusting their course by the lay of the land. The trail wound through open basins where antelope fled like pale ghosts, across ridges alive with wind, and down into valleys lush with new grass. The earth itself seemed to breathe after the long freeze. Yet in all that beauty there lingered the same unease, the sense of being watched, not by men, but by the land. One evening, as they made camp near a hot spring that steamed against the snowmelt, a young Crow named Tall Elk joined them. He spoke a little English learned from traders at Fort Cass. When Elias showed him the parchment, the boy studied it gravely. "This mark," he said, pointing to a symbol shaped like twin peaks, "is near the place we do not go. The rocks sing there at night, the water runs red after storms. My grandfather said the earth there is rich with the blood of the old ones." Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe iron," he said. "Rust in the ground." Tall Elk shrugged. "Maybe, but we still do not go." The next morning Elias rose before dawn. Mist lay thick over the plain, and the horses stamped restlessly. He climbed a low bluff behind camp and looked out across the waking land. The rising sun burned through the fog, revealing a shape far to the south, a massive mountain, its summit broad and flattened, the slope sweeping down like a bison's skull, half buried in grass. A chill went through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled the map from his coat and held it up to the light. The silhouette matched perfectly. The buffalo head. The old Spaniard's mark. Baptiste climbed up beside him, rubbing his hands for warmth. "You see it, eh? Now what?" Elias folded the parchment with care. "Now we go see if ghosts can be wrong." Baptiste sighed. "If they ain't, we'll be joining them." They rode that afternoon, cutting across ridges and streams until the mountain loomed close enough to fill the horizon. The wind off its slopes smelled of minerals and storm. Elias noticed strange outcrops along its base, piles of slag and broken stone, too regular to be natural. He dismounted and crouched, turning over a chunk of blackened ore. Inside the fissure glimmered a trace of dull metal. "Look here," he whispered. Worked stone. This wasn't shaped by weather. Baptiste squatted beside him, eyes wide. "Mon Dieu, maybe your map ain't lies after all." Elias straightened slowly, scanning the slope above. The air was unnaturally still. Somewhere high in the cliffs, a raven called once harsh and lonely. "We camp here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we climb." That evening, as they built their fire under a canopy of stars, Elias opened his journal and wrote by the flickering light, "The map continues to prove true. Found evidence of mining slag heaps. Smelted stone, marks of pick and shovel in places long weathered. The Crows speak of spirits and thunder, but I suspect Spaniards or Mexicans in search of copper or silver. Yet the air here feels thick with something older than tools." He paused, listening to the night. Far off, a low rumble echoed from within the mountain, like a sigh from the earth itself. Baptiste looked up sharply. "What was that?" Elias closed the book. "Maybe just the ground settling." But the sound came again, deeper now, rolling underfoot. The horses stamped and snorted, their eyes white in the firelight. Elias stared into the dark outline of the Buffalo Head Mountain and felt a strange certainty. Whatever had drawn those old Spaniards here, gold, copper, faith, or folly, it was not done yet, and by morning he meant to find out what they'd left behind. At dawn the mountain looked alive. Mist clung to its shoulders, and the rising sun turned the slopes from gray to molten copper. Elias Boone Hardesty stood at the mouth of a narrow canyon, studying the rock face where the stream vanished underground. His breath came slow and steady, the way it did before a climb or a shot. The air smelled of rain and iron. They had camped in the shadow of the Buffalo Head for 3 days, circling the base like wary wolves. Everywhere they went, they found signs that men had once worked here. Half-buried pits lined with rotten timbers, smelter stones blackened by ancient fire, and shards of clay crucibles mixed with gravel. Baptiste called them graves of greed. Elias called them evidence. By the 4th morning, curiosity won. They packed light rifles, water, a few strips of frozen smoked meat, and followed the creek upward into the canyon. The walls rose sheer on both sides, streaked red and gray, their surfaces grooved as if clawed by giants. Picas darted between boulders, and the water sang its thin metallic tune. "This place smells wrong," Baptiste muttered, "like a forge left cold." Elias ran a gloved hand along the wall. "Iron in the stone, maybe silver too. The old map called it Cobre Viejo, old copper." Baptiste spat. "Old foolishness, more like." Still they went on. The canyon narrowed until the sky was only a ribbon overhead. Around midday they reached a ledge where the creek dropped into a dark hole. Elias knelt beside it, holding up the lantern. A faint glimmer answered from below, not water, but the dull reflection of metal. "Mine shaft," he said softly. Collapsed, but not gone. They widened the mouth with their picks, moving slow and careful. The wood supports within had long since turned to dust. After an hour of digging, they could see the tunnel's interior, a narrow vein cutting into the heart of the mountain, walls veined with blue-green streaks. The air that drifted out was cold and dry, with the faintest tang of smoke, as if someone had only recently left. Baptiste crossed himself. "Boone, this place ain't slept quiet. You hear that?" Elias cocked his head. From somewhere deep in the rock came a sound like a sigh, followed by a low, rhythmic pulse. Thum, tum. Thum, not echo, but vibration, as if the earth itself were beating time. "It's the mountain shifting," Elias said, though his own voice sounded uncertain. They lit 2 tallow candles and stepped inside. The tunnel ran straight for perhaps 50 paces before bending sharply left. On the floor lay a line of old picks, their handles gone but their heads rusted solid. Against one wall stood a wooden cross, crude and blackened, the initials S.M. carved faintly into the beam. "Santa Maria," Baptiste whispered. The air grew colder as they advanced. The walls glittered faintly where the candlelight struck exposed ore ribbons of copper and traces of silver. Near the bend, Elias found something wedged in a crack of rock. A rusted pan, its bottom filled with what looked like hardened slag and a single frozen droplet of metal. He held it up, watching the light catch it. "They found something here, Baptiste." "Enough to prove the story." "Enough to die for, you mean?" When they emerged again into daylight, the sky had turned iron gray. A storm rolled in from the west, its front lit with distant lightning. They packed their gear in silence and started down the canyon, the first raindrops striking the stone like thrown shot. By the time they reached the valley floor, the storm was upon them, thunder echoing off the cliffs, wind tearing through the cottonwoods. They took shelter beneath an overhang, watching the rain turn the ground to red mud. The thunder deepened until it seemed to come from beneath their feet. Elias stared up the canyon, his mind replaying the sound he'd heard in the mine, that steady, hollow pulse. It matched the rhythm of the thunder now, as though the mountain were answering the sky. Baptiste's voice broke through his thoughts. "You'll mark me, Boone. Whatever those Spaniards woke in there never went back to sleep." Elias didn't argue. He only opened his journal and wrote with shaking hands. This day found the mine real and not rumor. Signs of deep digging, crucibles, ore still bright. Heard a strange beating from the rock, like a forge hammer beneath the earth. Can't say if it's my fancy or something living in the stone. He closed the book and looked toward the mountain. Lightning flared behind the buffalo head, and for a moment its outline glowed crimson against the clouds, as if the ancient fires had come alive again. Baptiste turned away. "We should leave this place come. Morning." Elias nodded slowly. "Aye," he said. "But not before I take one stone from its heart proof for those who said the map was a lie." He looked down at the chunk of ore in his palm, slick with rain, heavy as faith. When the thunder rolled again, the echo in the canyon answered with a sound not unlike a hammer striking anvil, the voice of old work still echoing through time. And neither man slept that night. By the time Elias Boone Hardesty rode into Fort Union, the mountain snows had melted from his clothes, but not from his eyes. He carried little with him, a single mule, a bundle of beaver pelts, and a small leather pouch that clinked faintly when it moved. Baptiste had turned back toward the Yellowstone to winter with the crows, muttering that he'd had enough of ghosts and thunder. Elias went east alone. The fort stood on a bluff above the Missouri, a sprawl of adobe and log palisades surrounded by a sea of mud and wagon ruts. Smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge, oxen lowed in the stockade yard, men shouted in a dozen tongues, French, English, Mandan, Sioux. It was late season, and the traders were restless to tally their furs before the first freeze. Elias dismounted, stiff and road-worn, and made for the trading room. Charles Larpenteur himself sat behind the counter, his pen scratching ledger lines. He looked up as Elias dropped the leather pouch onto the table. It landed with a metallic thud. "What's this, Boone?" Larpenteur asked, pushing back his spectacles. "Stone," Elias said, "from the mountains west of the Bighorn, Spanish diggings. Thought you might know the worth." The trader untied the thong, poured out the contents, 2 dull chunks of ore, streaked with blue and green, and 1 sliver of hammered metal that gleamed even in the dim light. Larpenteur held it up, turning it between his fingers. "Copper, by the look," he said. "Good color, but nothing to freight a mule across the plains." 4. Elias smiled thinly. "There's more where that came from, whole veins. I seen the shafts myself, timbers older than any fort in this country. Spaniards worked it once. Must be silver mixed in the copper. The fires left slag bright as glass." Larpenteur chuckled, jotting a note. "Every trapper's got a story, Boone. Spaniards, lost mines, cities of gold, they all sound the same after a while. You sell the ore, or you just want a drink for the telling." Elias leaned on the counter. "I'm not asking for whiskey. I'm asking for ears. The map was real. I've walked the ground." The trader sighed, setting down the ore. "Listen, my friend, the trade's changing. Beavers are near trapped out. Street? Louis wants robes and buffalo now, not fables. You bring pelts, I pay good coin. You bring rock, I give you the same look I give every dreamer headed east with a saddlebag full of dirt." The words hit harder than Elias cared to admit. For 2 years he had followed that damned map. Through hunger, snow, and fire, found proof carved in the bones of a mountain, only to be met with laughter. He gathered the stones, tied the pouch shut, and straightened. "Then I'll take my dirt elsewhere," he said quietly. He followed the Missouri downriver with the trader's boats, silent as a man half-ghost himself. The river broadened, its banks alive with cottonwoods and smoke from steamboats heading upstream. By the time he reached Street Louis, autumn lay thick over the city, a haze of coal and commerce. Brick warehouses lined the levee, barrels of whiskey, and furs stacked higher than a man's head. The frontier had already begun to retreat. He found Ashley's old partner, William Sublette, at a tavern near the riverfront. The once famous trapper was now a merchant, prosperous and paunchy, his hands soft with ink rather than frostbite. When Elias unrolled the Spanish map on the table, Sublette smiled the way a banker does at a gambler's last coin. "So this is the treasure everyone whispers about," Sublette said. "You truly mean to tell me you found a mine out yonder?" "I've seen it," Elias replied. "Worked shafts, smelter slag, even the cross they prayed under. The ore is real. I've got it here." Sublette turned the pouch over in his palm, unimpressed. "I've seen better stone in riverbeds. Boone, men like you don't understand the way of things. The fur trade's dying. Gold, silver, they're for governments, not lone riders. The country out there's closing fast. What's left is a wilderness of bones and stories." Elias met his gaze. "Then maybe the stories are all that's worth saving." Sublette laughed softly. "You sound like a preacher." "Or a fool. Sometimes there's no difference." He took back the pouch, folded the map, and left without another word. Outside, the evening fog rolled in from the river, thick with the smell of coal smoke and wet timber. That night, in APM Sage, a cheap room above the wharf, Elias lit a tallow candle and opened his journal. The ink bled slightly on the paper as he wrote, "Men will not believe what the land tells them. They call stone a lie, mountain thunder a trick of wind. Yet I have seen the marks of hands older than my own, heard the earth speak through iron. If faith is folly, I'll wear the name gladly." He closed the book, wrapped the map and the ore in oilcloth, and slid them beneath the floorboard. Outside, the steamboat whistles blew, bound west again toward the country that had given him both proof and solitude. In the morning, he would leave Street Louis behind. He had no desire to argue with merchants or fools. The mountains still waited, and somewhere in their frozen smoke the truth endured, untouched by disbelief. Elias blew out the candle. In the darkness the river's murmur sounded like distant wind through pines, calling him home. 3 winters had come and gone since Elias Boone Hardesty rode east, with a saddlebag full of ore and a head full of ghosts. The world had changed in that time. The rendezvous were smaller now. The beaver trade was dying, and men who once measured wealth in plues were trading for robes or whiskey instead. Forts rose where the old camps had stood, and new faces, clerks, settlers, missionaries, followed the trails he and his kind had opened with blood and frost. Elias had no taste for any of it. He had drifted from post to post, trapping when the rivers allowed, hunting when they didn't, and speaking little. The Spanish map lay folded deep in his pack, untouched since Street Louis. Some nights, by the fire, he would feel its weight and remember the sound of thunder under the mountain, that hollow hammering that seemed to echo from another age. Then he would push the thought away and stare into the flames until morning. Now, in the spring of 1837, he found himself once again in the Green River Valley, the country where his wandering had first begun. The cottonwoods were leafing out, the river ran full and silver with meltwater, and the sky stretched clear as polished flint. He had come to find peace, though he hardly believed in such a thing any more. His camp sat near a rise where 3 stones marked a shallow mound, the place where, years earlier, he had buried the rawhide bags of frozen smoked meat. He had done it in jest, half to prove a theory, half to outwit hunger. The winters since had been too long and hard for him to return until now. That morning, as the light broke over the valley, he took his knife and shovel and began to dig. The earth was soft, fragrant with thaw. Beneath a layer of roots and sand, he struck the edge of rawhide. The bindings were brittle but unbroken. When he peeled them back, the smell that rose was faint, almost sweet, not rot, but wood smoke and fat. The meat inside was dark, dry, and whole. He cut a piece with his knife and brought it to his nose, then to his tongue. It was good, not fresh, not new, but good. He sat back on his heels and laughed for the first time in years. The sound startled the magpies from the trees, 3 winters, just as he had written. The frozen smoke had kept its promise when men had not. He built a small fire and roasted a strip over the coals, the scent rising with the morning mist. For a moment the years fell away the storms, the ridicule, the long rides through empty country. He tasted his own survival, and it was enough. By midday a small party of trappers came down the river trail, young men, green-faced, talking too loud. They hailed him from a distance, asking if he'd trade. When they saw his solitary fire and the lean lines of his face, they grew quieter. One recognized him and whispered the name that had followed him like a rumor, Boone Hardesty, the man with the Spanish map. They sat with him a while, sharing coffee and stories. The youngest, not 20 yet, leaned forward eagerly. "They say you found a mine out west. Real Spanish diggings. That true?" Elias poked the fire with a stick. "I found something," he said. "But it wasn't what I was looking for." "What was it then?" He looked at the boy, the same hunger in his eyes that he himself had once carried. "Truth," he said. "The kind that don't fit in a pack." The boy frowned, disappointed, and changed the subject to beaver prices. Elias listened with half an ear, watching the smoke curl upward into the blue. When the trappers rode on, he felt only relief at the silence left behind. That evening, as the sun sank over the Wind River Range, Elias opened his old journal. The pages were worn and smudged, but the last entry he had written years before still stood clear. "If faith is folly, I'll wear the name gladly." He added one final line beneath it. "The mountains keep their secrets, but the cold remembers who listens." He closed the book, set it beside the fire, and looked toward the distant ridges. Somewhere beyond them lay the Buffalo Head, its veins of iron and copper sealed again by time. Men would come chasing gold soon enough. They always did. But the mountain would outlast them, as it had outlasted him. When the stars came out, he wrapped himself in his robe and lay back on the cool earth. The wind carried the scent of spruce and far snow. In the quiet he thought he heard that old sound again, a faint hammering, deep in the bones of the world, only this time it was not thunder or ghostly work. It was his own heartbeat, steady and untroubled, keeping time with the land that had finally claimed him.